A millionaire had everything money could buy, until a poor girl selling water stole his heart. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. On a sweltering summer afternoon in downtown Chicago, where tourists bustled in high-rises, cast long shadows over the crowded streets, something happened that would quietly alter the course of two completely different lives. Julian Westwood, the man behind Chicago's most ambitious real estate empire, was on his way to a high-profile investor meeting. Every step he took was calculated, every second of his time scheduled. His tailored suit, his gleaming cufflinks, and the quiet hum of his luxury town car waiting nearby all signaled one thing: control. Control over money, over people, over outcomes. He had built a reputation for being untouchable, emotionless, a man whose heart was rumored to be as cold as the steel buildings he owned. But on that particular day, as he stood at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, something broke through the noise and rhythm of his world. Cold water, $2, the best deal you'll find in this heat. A voice rang out with such confidence and grit that it sliced through the city's static like a blade. Julian turned his head and spotted her. She stood on the corner with a cracked plastic cooler, her jeans faded and torn at the knees, a tank top stained with sweat, and her brown hair tied in a messy knot behind her head. But there was nothing pitiful about her. Her stance was firm, eyes sharp, like she wasn't just selling water. She was commanding the space around her. He watched as a man in a suit, one not unlike his own, snatched a bottle from her table and took a long swig. When she asked for payment, the man scoffed. $2? This stuff's $1 at the store. What a scam! Her response made Julian freeze. You drank the whole thing, sir, she said coolly. If you don't want to pay, spit it back into the bottle and I'll happily take it back. The man blinked. Excuse me? I said, return the product if you don't want to pay. Spit it out. I'll wait. A few people nearby chuckled. Julian, caught completely off guard, stared at her. Not because she'd embarrassed the man, although she had, but because she didn't flinch. Not when the man stepped closer. Not when he muttered something under his breath. She stood her ground, chin raised like a queen on a street corner. The man grumbled, threw a crumpled bill on the table, and stormed off. The girl didn't even watch him leave. She calmly dropped the money into a tin can beside her cooler and resumed calling out to pedestrians. That was the moment Julian's world paused. He had spent decades surrounded by people who tiptoed around his name, who said what he wanted to hear, who crumbled at the slightest shift in his tone. But this girl, this total stranger, had backbone, fire, a strange and unwavering dignity, even as sweat dripped down her brow and her sneakers looked ready to fall apart. He wasn't the type to act on impulse. In fact, Julian Westwood prided himself on being immune to impulsive decisions. But something about her stirred a curiosity that wouldn't let go. He crossed the street, not fully knowing why. As he approached, she narrowed her eyes. You look lost, sir, she said, without looking up. Or are you just window shopping for bottled water now? He almost laughed. No one spoke to him like that. Ever. How much for all of it? He asked calmly. She blinked. All the water? Yes. Why? Julian pulled $100 bill from his wallet and placed it gently on the table. Let's just say I respect a good salesperson. She stared at the money, then at him. Respect or guilt? Because if this is some rich guy trying to sleep better at night, I'm not interested in being your feel-good story. No story, Julian said. Just business. He picked up 2 bottles and walked away. As he got into his car, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw her watching him, arms crossed, a mix of suspicion and curiosity in her gaze. Her presence lingered in his mind long after the car pulled away from the curb, and though he didn't know it yet, that brief exchange would mark the beginning of a transformation neither of them saw coming. Because Julian Westwood wasn't used to being intrigued, and Isabella Flores had no idea she had just rattled the heart of a man the entire city thought didn't have one. The next morning, Isabella Flores was back on the same corner, just as relentless as the day before. The cooler had new ice, her sleeves were rolled up, and her tone was as sharp as ever. She wasn't selling water, she was surviving, and there was a quiet defiance in her every move. Julian Westwood, from the 38th floor of his high-rise office overlooking the heart of Chicago, found his thoughts drifting again, not to the contracts on his desk or the shareholder meeting coming up, but to the girl with the cooler. It was unsettling. Julian had built his life on predictability. He had rules for everything: who he allowed into his circle, how he handled business, and especially how he kept his distance. But Isabella had fractured something, not with beauty, not with charm, but with raw truth. The kind of truth that money couldn't argue with. The way she stared him down. The way she made him feel small with nothing more than a glance. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. So when the meeting ended early and his driver asked, "Home or the club, Mr. Westwood?" Julian answered without hesitation, "Neither. Michigan and Monroe. Drop me off at the corner." His driver raised a brow but said nothing. Isabella didn't notice him right away. She was busy negotiating with a teenager, trying to get a discount on 2 bottles. She held firm. $4, sweetheart. If you want the third one free, bring me a winning lottery ticket. Julian stood a few steps back, listening, watching. She had presence, something he hadn't seen even in the most poised boardroom executives. She turned and caught sight of him. "Oh no," she muttered, hands on her hips. "The $100 water guy is back." He smirked. "Guilty? You realize people only spend that much on water when they're running from something, right?" she said. "Or running toward something." She rolled her eyes. "So, which is it?" Julian stepped closer. "Maybe I'm just here for a conversation." "I'm not a therapist, and I don't have time for interviews," she replied, already attending to another customer. He waited patiently as she handed over change and offered a smile to a young mother pushing a stroller. Her humanity was effortless. "I want to ask you something," Julian said, once the sidewalk had cleared. She glanced at him, unconvinced. This ought to be good. "I'm hosting a community business panel tomorrow. Young entrepreneurs, speakers from tech, finance, and retail. I think you should be there." Isabella blinked. "You think I should be there?" "Yes." "Do I look like someone who gets invited to 5-star panels?" "More than you know." She let out a short laugh. "Look, I don't know what this is, but I sell water on a street corner. I didn't go to business school. I didn't build a company." Julian met her gaze. "You sell a product. You face rejection all day. You manage your own stock, handle marketing with nothing but your voice, and negotiate like a shark. If that's not entrepreneurship, I don't know what is." The words hit her harder than she wanted to admit. No one had ever framed it that way before. To most, she was just a girl hustling under the sun. But the way he said it, it felt like more. "I can't afford to miss work," she replied, voice quieter now. Julian pulled a business card from his wallet. "If you change your mind, I'll make sure you're compensated for the time." She didn't take the card at first. Then slowly, almost cautiously, she reached for it. "I'm not promising anything," she said. "I wouldn't expect you to." He turned and walked away. This time, she watched him go. That night, as Isabella stood at the sink in her shared apartment scrubbing dishes, the business card sat beside her phone. Her roommate, Nia, raised a brow. "Who's Julian Westwood?" She tried to sound casual. "Some guy who wants me to speak at some business panel." Nia's jaw dropped. "Wait, the Julian Westwood? As in the man who basically owns half of this city? I guess. And you met him how? At a club?" "No, selling water." Nia stared at her like she'd grown wings. "Girl, you better go. This is huge." Isabella shrugged. "I don't want to be anyone's charity case." "Maybe it's not charity. Maybe he sees something in you." But that was exactly what scared her. Because if someone like Julian Westwood saw her, really saw her, it meant she was visible. And being visible had never felt safe. Still, long after the dishes were done and the lights were out, Isabella lay awake staring at the ceiling, the business card on her nightstand catching the light of passing cars. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered what her life might look like if she stepped into a world that wasn't built from concrete and sweat, but from trust. Maybe tomorrow she'd find out. The morning of the business panel dawned colder than expected for mid-April in Chicago. A soft breeze rolled off Lake Michigan, weaving between the city's steel towers and settling into the corners where morning sunlight hadn't yet reached. Isabella stood in front of her mirror, tying her curls into a loose bun and staring at her reflection like she didn't quite recognize the woman in the glass. She wore a simple navy blouse borrowed from Nia, pressed slacks she had thrifted months ago for job interviews, and flats that had just enough life left in them to carry her through the day. She wasn't sure why she was doing this. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because for the first time in a long while, someone had looked at her and seen more than a struggling girl with a cooler full of melting ice. Julian's event was held at the Tribune Tower, a space known for glass walls and panoramic views of the skyline. The lobby alone felt like another universe. Marble floors, soft jazz music, and well-dressed people who barely looked up as she walked in. A young woman with a clipboard greeted her with a warm smile. "Isabella Flores." She nodded, clutching her canvas tote a little tighter. "Welcome. Mr. Westwood left specific instructions to have you seated on stage, third from the left." "On stage?" The woman laughed lightly. "Yes, you're one of the featured speakers." Isabella felt her breath catch. She had assumed she'd be watching, maybe sitting in the crowd, definitely not speaking. But there it was, her name printed on the schedule, sandwiched between a hedge fund director and a wellness brand founder. She followed the assistant to the back room where panelists were gathering. Everyone looked so polished, so certain. It felt like walking into a museum exhibit titled "People Who Have Already Made It." She took a deep breath and tried to stay small in the corner. Julian arrived not long after, dressed in a charcoal suit that made the other executives seem underdressed by comparison. His presence changed the atmosphere instantly. People straightened. Conversations paused, but his eyes scanned the room for only one person. When they landed on Isabella, something shifted in his expression. "You came?" he said quietly, walking over. "I did," she replied, meeting his gaze. "Still not sure why." Julian smiled, his voice low. "You'll know by the end of today." Before she could ask what he meant, an assistant ushered the speakers toward the stage. Isabella's heart pounded as she took her seat, avoiding the curious glances from the other panelists. The host began introducing each guest with glowing accolades, and when it was her turn, there was a pause, a longer one than the others. And finally, the host said, "We have Isabella Flores, street entrepreneur, daily proof that hustle has a heartbeat. She runs an independent water vending operation on Michigan Avenue. She doesn't have millions in funding, but she has grit, and she's here because Julian Westwood believes that's a kind of capital we don't talk about enough." The crowd was silent. Then came a ripple of applause, hesitant at first, but building. Isabella felt her hands tremble in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, she leaned into the microphone and did the only thing she knew how to do: tell the truth. "I didn't come here to impress anyone," she began, "and I'm not sure I belong here. But I do know what it feels like to count change in your palm and wonder if it'll stretch far enough to feed you and keep your lights on. I know what it's like to pitch a product to people who won't make eye contact. I know what it's like to wake up and fight every hour for your place in the world." There was no performance in her voice, just honesty. "I don't have a business plan. I don't have investors. I have a cooler, a sidewalk, and a reason. That reason is rent, groceries, the dream of maybe one day being able to choose between surviving and living." The room was still. Julian sat in the front row, watching her, not with pride or ownership, but something gentler: respect, maybe even admiration. After the panel, people flooded the stage. A woman from a local startup handed Isabella her card. A professor from DePaul offered to connect her with a business mentor. Someone else asked if they could interview her for a community podcast. Julian waited until the crowd thinned before stepping closer. "You did more than I ever could have hoped for," he said softly. Isabella turned to him, surprised by the emotion behind his voice. "Why did you do this?" "Because someone needed to hear you," he replied, "and maybe because I needed to hear you too." She didn't know what to say. So much of her life had been lived on the defense, shielding herself from pity, from judgment. But now, there was no pity in Julian's eyes, only belief. As they walked side by side through the towering glass doors back onto the street, Isabella caught her reflection in the glass. A girl who had walked in afraid, but was now leaving with something new in her chest: possibility. And beside her, the man she had once dismissed as an out-of-touch millionaire, now the only person who had ever dared to say out loud that her story mattered. The week following the panel shifted something inside Isabella, though she couldn't quite define it. She went back to her routine on Michigan Avenue, cooler in tow, water stacked in neat rows. But now, passers-by looked at her differently. A few even recognized her. "Aren't you the girl from that business talk?" a young woman asked, pausing with her iced coffee in hand. Isabella offered a shy smile. "That was me." The woman handed over a $5 bill and waved off the change. "You were amazing. Keep going." Isabella murmured a thank you, still not used to being seen. Yet despite the buzz and encouragement, She couldn't stop thinking about Julian. He hadn't contacted her since the event. No texts, no calls, not even a casual drop-by. It made sense, she supposed. He had brought her into his world, given her a platform. And maybe that was all it had ever meant. A gesture, a moment, nothing more. But the silence gnawed at her. One cloudy afternoon, as she packed up her cart earlier than usual, she found herself walking north. No real destination, just a need to keep moving. Her feet carried her to Lincoln Park, where the trees swayed gently in the spring wind, and joggers passed without a second glance. She sank onto a bench, letting the hush of nature swallow the noise in her head. You always disappear when you're thinking. The voice startled her. She looked up, and there he was, Julian Westwood in a navy peacoat. No security, no entourage, just a man with his hands in his pockets and an expression she couldn't read. "I thought you vanished," she said, her voice even. He walked over and sat beside her, not too close. "I needed to give you space." "Why?" "Because I didn't want you to feel like I expected anything after the panel. That was your moment, not mine." She turned to him slowly, studying his profile. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were softer than she remembered. "I thought you forgot about me." Julian laughed under his breath, but it wasn't amused. "Isabella, I haven't stopped thinking about you." There was silence between them then, not uncomfortable, but loaded. The kind that stretches because there's too much to say and no idea where to begin. Finally, he asked, "How did it feel, speaking up like that?" She looked at her hands. Terrifying. But right, like I'd been waiting my whole life to tell the truth. "I'm glad you did," Julian said. "You didn't just move people, you made them listen." She glanced at him. "Why do you care so much? About me? About any of this?" Julian hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Then quietly, he said, "Because I see you. Really see you. And I know what it's like to fight alone." She tilted her head. "You? A man with a building named after you?" He chuckled, but there was no joy in it. Wealth doesn't erase loneliness or make you immune to pain. Isabella stayed silent, sensing there was more, but unwilling to press. He went on, his voice softer now. "My parents died when I was 17. Car crash. I inherited everything before I even knew who I was. I spent years trying to prove I deserved it. I built companies, bought silence, made headlines. But nothing I created ever felt real. Not until I saw you arguing with a stranger over a bottle of water." She blinked, stunned. "That day?" she asked, incredulous. "That day?" He nodded. "You weren't afraid. You stood your ground, and I thought, there's someone who doesn't owe the world an apology for existing." Isabella looked down, her throat tightening. She had never been anyone's inspiration. Not really. She had always been the girl people overlooked or pitied. "Julian," she said slowly, "I don't know what any of this is between us. I don't have a map for it, but I don't want to be someone's story. I don't want to be a project." "You're not," he said firmly. "You never were." They sat there for a long while, watching the wind ripple across the pond, letting the quiet carry what words could not. Before they parted, Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "There's something I want you to consider. It's nothing big, yet, but I think it could be." Isabella unfolded it. It was a proposal, a rough outline for a small urban retail space, a mobile vendor hub that could serve women like her. No charity, no tricks. A partnership. She looked up at him. You're serious? I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. And for the first time since they met, Isabella allowed herself to believe that maybe this wasn't just chance. Maybe it was the beginning of something deeper than either of them had expected. The proposal Julian had given her stayed folded in Isabella's bag for 3 days. She didn't read it again, not because she wasn't curious, but because she was afraid of what it might awaken. Possibilities she had trained herself not to believe in. Dreams, after all, were luxuries when you were just trying to survive. But on the 4th morning, as she sat alone in the quiet corner of her neighborhood cafe, sipping weak coffee, she finally unfolded it. It wasn't just a pitch. It was a vision. Julian had drafted an idea for a co-op style marketplace for mobile vendors, especially for women from underserved backgrounds. The place would offer shared refrigeration, marketing support, and even mentorship for scaling into formal businesses. The space would be funded by a blend of private investment and a nonprofit foundation he was quietly establishing. And beneath all the formalities, there was a handwritten note. You're not just part of this, you're the reason for it. She reread that line over and over until the letters blurred. The idea lit something inside her she thought had been extinguished. Not just hope, but power. The power to create something that would outlast her hustle on the streets. Still, that same familiar voice of caution whispered in her ear. Don't get too close. Don't let him give you more than you can return. Later that day, Isabella called him. I read it, she said plainly, when he picked up. There was a pause. And I have questions. And I'm not saying yes to anything. Not yet. I wouldn't expect you to, Julian said, his voice measured, but she could hear the relief. They agreed to meet the next afternoon at a local community center that hosted pop-up events. Julian had arranged a walkthrough, wanting her to see one of the potential locations. When she arrived, he was already there, sleeves rolled up, talking with the property manager like someone who belonged more in a toolbox than a boardroom. You look out of place, she teased as she approached. He smiled. Good. That's the point. The building was modest, tucked between 2 larger commercial spaces in the heart of the Bronzeville neighborhood. The interior smelled faintly of dust and old paint, but the bones of it were strong. There were wide windows, a concrete floor, and space enough for 6 or 7 vendor stalls. Isabella walked through the space in silence, running her fingers along the walls, imagining what it could be. Julian followed behind but kept his distance. I wanted you to see it before we got too deep in the details. You should be the one who decides if it's worth fighting for. Isabella turned slowly. Why me? Because this isn't a favor, he said. It's a collaboration. You know the community. You know what's needed. I've got resources, yes, but without someone who understands the ground, this place is just another empty building with good intentions. She studied him carefully. You don't want a photo op or a headline. Julian shook his head. I want something real, something that matters. I think you do too. For a moment she didn't reply. Then she took a deep breath. If we do this, I want creative control over how the vendor spaces are allocated. I want a say in the hiring, and I want this place to be self-sustaining, not another charity that dies when the funding runs dry. Julian smiled. Then we'll build it that way. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Between city permits, community outreach, and vendor interviews, Isabella found herself in meetings she'd never imagined attending. Julian insisted she take the lead during presentations, deferring to her insight, her instincts. It was disarming at first, being treated like an equal in spaces where she used to feel invisible. They fought, too, about logistics, timelines, budgets. He was used to speed. She demanded patience. One evening, after a particularly tense disagreement about vendor eligibility, Isabella stood up in the middle of their meeting and said, "This isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet, Julian. These are real people. Don't forget that." He didn't argue. He just nodded, looked her in the eyes, and said quietly, "You're right." They stayed late that night, going over revised plans, eating cheap takeout on the floor of the unfinished space. And as the hours passed, something shifted between them, not in words, but in proximity. The kind that happens when two people realize they're not just building something with each other, but for each other. Isabella looked at him across the scattered blueprints. "Why did you really come back to the park that day? After the panel?" Julian leaned back, his expression unreadable for a moment. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you. Not just the way you challenged that guy, or the way you held your ground with me, but because you reminded me what it feels like to fight for something that isn't measured in profit." She looked down, unsure of what to say. Julian didn't press her. He simply added, "You don't have to say anything. Just don't shut me out." And she didn't. Not that night. Not anymore. Because the truth was, she felt it too, whatever this was becoming. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't something she needed to fight against. Maybe it was the one thing worth fighting for. Weeks passed, and the once dusty, forgotten building began to take shape into something vibrant and full of promise. The project, officially named the Riverwalk Market, had gained momentum faster than anyone expected. Community leaders were on board. Local artisans began signing up for spaces. And even the mayor's office took interest after word spread about the initiative started by a corporate giant and a street vendor. But while everything on the surface looked like progress, there was a storm brewing beneath. Isabella had become the heartbeat of the project. She met with vendors, mediated conflicts, taught newcomers how to price and present their goods. Everyone saw her as the visionary, the fighter. But what they didn't see were the long nights she spent lying awake, questioning everything. Was she ready for this kind of visibility? This kind of responsibility? And what did it mean for her and Julian? They had grown undeniably close, not just in business, but in a way that hovered just beneath the edge of intimacy. He brought her coffee without asking how she took it. She finished his sentences. Their silences weren't empty. They were full of unspoken things. But neither had dared to address the space between them, afraid that naming it would somehow ruin it. Until the gala. The gala was a celebration marking the soft launch of the Riverwalk Market. It was supposed to be a modest event for the community, but as more donors and city officials expressed interest, it quickly evolved into something much grander. Julian insisted on keeping it grounded. No red carpets, no exclusive lists, but there was still a level of formality that made Isabella feel uneasy. On the night of the event, Isabella wore a simple navy blue dress borrowed from her friend Camilla. Her curls were pinned back, and for the first time in a long time, she looked in the mirror and saw someone who didn't seem to be hiding anymore. Julian stood at the entrance of the venue, greeting guests. When he saw her walk in, his expression changed. Not dramatically, but with that unmistakable pause of someone who's just been knocked breathless. He didn't say anything right away. He just stepped forward and offered his arm. "You look," he began, then stopped. "Exactly like the woman who built all this." She smiled nervously. "Don't overdo it." "I'm not," he replied. "You just haven't realized how much you've become yet." Throughout the evening, people approached Isabella to thank her, to ask her about the project, to praise her courage. But beneath the clinking of glasses and the polite conversation, she could feel something shifting. Julian stayed by her side, but not too close, always aware of how public things were now. She noticed him glance at her, then away. It was like they were dancing in circles around something they both felt but hadn't dared to touch. Then came the moment that changed everything. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd thinned and the music softened, Julian approached her near the back of the venue, where strings of light cast a soft glow on the garden behind the building. No one else was around. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. She looked up at him, a mix of anticipation and caution in her eyes. "Go on." He took a breath. "Are you happy?" It was such a simple question, yet it hit her like a punch. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I would be once this place was real, but it's complicated." "Because of me?" She hesitated. "Because of me." Julian stepped closer. "Isabella, I've tried to give you space because I thought that's what you needed. But if I've done anything to make you feel like you're being swallowed up by my world again, I'm sorry. That's not what I want." She studied him, her voice quieter now. "You're not the problem. It's the fear. Every time I start to feel something for you, really feel it, I hear this voice in my head telling me I'll lose myself if I give in." "And what does your heart say?" he asked, searching her expression. Her answer came slowly, but it was clear. "It says I already have. A little." Julian reached for her hand. "Then maybe we stop thinking so much. Maybe we just let it happen. No promises, no labels. Just this, what we've built, what we're becoming." She didn't reply with words. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the small space between them, and let herself rest her head lightly against his chest. His arms folded around her, not possessively, but gently, like he knew how long she had fought to get there. And in that stillness, something unspoken became solid, a beginning, not marked by declarations or grand gestures, but by presence, trust, quiet commitment. The gala ended with no fanfare, no announcement of their feelings, just the hum of hope hanging in the air between them. And outside the venue, the first sign for the Riverwalk Market was finally installed. A place built by two people from different worlds who found, against every odd, something worth building together. The days after the gala unfolded with a soft intensity, like the slow bloom of a flower after the rain. The Riverwalk Market officially opened to the public, and what had once been an abandoned strip of brick and concrete was now teeming with color, sound, and life. Every morning, Isabella arrived early, long before the first customer, and walked the aisles with a quiet pride. Her story was in every corner, in the murals painted by local artists, in the laughter of children chasing each other around the food stands, in the smell of bread from the family-owned bakery that had almost closed before the market gave it a second chance. Julian became a familiar face among the vendors, though he never used his name to gain attention. He helped when something broke, offered advice when asked, and stayed out of the spotlight. To most people, he was just the sharply dressed man who seemed to care a little too much for someone not making a profit. But between him and Isabella, something fragile was growing stronger. Their connection no longer felt like a collision of two worlds. It felt like a merging of them. And yet, beneath the surface, a new tension began to rise. Julian had gone quiet about his business affairs lately, and Isabella had noticed. The calls he once took openly were now behind closed doors. He smiled the same way, spoke the same way, but something was different, guarded. One afternoon, as they sat together on a bench outside the market watching a group of teenagers perform music on the small stage, Isabella finally broke the silence. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Julian's fingers, which had been gently tapping his knee in rhythm with the music, stopped. He turned to her, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "You're distracted. Your assistant called you 3 times this morning and you didn't pick up. You're keeping something from me." Julian exhaled, folding his hands. "A client in Singapore offered me a 2-year expansion contract. It would mean launching a new division of my company overseas. It's something I've been working toward for a long time." She nodded slowly, feeling her chest tighten. "And you're going to take it." "I don't know," he said. "I haven't decided." Isabella looked away, her voice soft. "You don't have to lie to protect me." Julian turned to her, his tone more urgent. "I'm not lying. I haven't accepted it because I don't want to leave this." "This?" she echoed, her voice catching. "You. Us. What we've built here." His eyes searched hers. "But I also know who I am, Isabella. I built a life on momentum, on never staying in one place too long. And now, for the first time, I don't know if I'm supposed to change that." The truth hit hard. She admired Julian's ambition. It was part of what drew her to him. But it was also the thing that could take him away. Isabella stood, folding her arms. "I won't ask you to stay. If that's what you're waiting for, I can't give it to you." "I'm not waiting for permission," he said, rising too. "I'm trying to figure out if I can be the man who chooses something else, someone else, over everything I've ever known." She looked at him, the ache building in her chest. "Don't choose me if you'll resent it later." And with that, she turned and walked back into the crowd, leaving Julian standing alone among the echo of street music and chatter. That night, Isabella lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remind herself of all the things she had learned. She had fought too hard for her independence to let someone else's path dictate hers. She couldn't follow a man across the world. She had her mother to care for, her college dreams still unfolding, and now this community that relied on her more than ever. But the thought of waking up and not seeing Julian again, of not hearing his offhand remarks or watching him stubbornly fumble with simple vendor tasks, left a hollow space in her chest. Across town, Julian stared out at the city skyline from his penthouse. The contract sat on his desk, unsigned. The phone rang twice, his assistant again, but he didn't answer. He thought about all the things he had built, all the deals he had closed, and how none of them compared to the quiet joy he felt when Isabella smiled at him like he mattered for something other than his money. He had once believed that power meant freedom, but now he realized without love, even the freest man could be lost. Morning came with a sharp chill in the air, and Isabella opened the market as usual. But something was off. The community board, where vendors posted updates, had a note pinned in the center. Her name was written on it. She pulled it down and read, "Meet me tonight," where it all started. There was no signature, but she didn't need one. When night fell, Isabella returned to the alley where she used to sell water, the place Julian had first noticed her. It looked different now. Brighter, somehow. Cleaner, but still carried the weight of their beginnings. As she approached, she saw him waiting there in a simple coat. No luxury, no entourage, just him. "I'm not going to Singapore," Julian said before she could speak. She froze. "What?" "I turned it down. I called them this morning and said no. I'm staying." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why?" He stepped forward. "Because I don't want a future that doesn't have you in it. Because I'm tired of chasing more when I've already found enough." Tears stung her eyes as he reached out and held her hands between his. "I choose this. I choose you." And just like that, the walls she had spent years building began to fall. Not because she was giving up who she was, but because, for the first time, she believed someone saw her clearly and loved her for it. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. In that moment, surrounded by the echo of old memories and the promise of new beginnings, their love no longer lived in possibility. It had become real. The days following Julian's decision not to go to Singapore were quiet, but not in the way that felt like distance or silence. It was the kind of quiet that came with peace, a stillness in the heart that Isabella hadn't felt in years. She went to the market each day with renewed purpose, but now with someone at her side who wasn't just a fleeting presence. Julian had become part of her rhythm. He would walk her to her stand in the mornings, help set up the cooler, sometimes clumsily carry crates of bottles while grumbling about the wait, and yet never failed to show up. Their lives didn't blend perfectly. There were moments of friction, misunderstandings sparked by their different backgrounds. But there was patience now, and a willingness to bridge every gap. Julian had started teaching entrepreneurship workshops on weekends at the community center, and Isabella couldn't help but smile every time she caught glimpses of him explaining profit margins to teenagers who barely stayed awake through their school lessons. But he found a way to reach them, just like he had with her. One evening, while they sat on the rooftop of Isabella's apartment building, sharing takeout and watching the sun bleed across the skyline, Julian turned to her with a look that she'd come to know too well. Serious, thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said, resting his arm along the back of the lawn chair. "That's dangerous," Isabella teased lightly, nudging his knee. He smiled, but didn't break eye contact. "About something bigger. About creating a foundation." She blinked. "A foundation? A nonprofit. One that helps young entrepreneurs from underprivileged communities get real mentorship, resources, funding. I've been running numbers in my head. I could fund the initial phase easily, but I'd need someone who understands the street-level hustle to help lead it." She gave a small laugh, unsure. "Let me guess. You mean me?" Julian nodded. "I know it's a lot, but who better than you? You built your life bottle by bottle. You've inspired half the people in this market, and probably more without even realizing it." Isabella looked down at her drink, stirring the straw absently. "I don't know, Julian. I'm not used to boardrooms and charity galas. I'm not sure I belong in that world." He reached for her hand gently. "You belong wherever you decide to stand, and that world needs someone like you more than you need it. His words didn't feel like flattery. They felt like truth, wrapped in belief. And it wasn't the first time Julian had offered her something bigger than survival. It was the first time she felt ready to say yes. The next morning, they met with lawyers, consultants, and community leaders to begin forming what would be called the Carter and Gray Foundation, a name Julian insisted should come first with hers. The process was overwhelming, but Isabella found herself thriving in spaces she once feared. She didn't pretend to know everything, but she asked the right questions, and more importantly, she listened. Her voice carried weight in rooms that once would have dismissed her. It wasn't all smooth. There were critics, some from Julian's circle, who questioned his decision to tie himself so deeply to a woman without pedigree, and others who whispered behind Isabella's back, calling her the charity case turned board member. But she stood her ground, with Julian beside her, and more importantly, with her own conviction built from years of struggle. She didn't shrink, and the foundation began to bloom. They launched their first initiative in a neighborhood not far from where Isabella used to sell water, a youth entrepreneurship lab with mentorship programs, a small startup fund, and workshops taught by real business owners, including street vendors. When the ribbon-cutting ceremony happened, Isabella didn't want the spotlight, but Julian insisted she speak. As she stood before a small crowd, microphone trembling slightly in her hands, she looked out and saw not just Julian, but her mother, her old co-workers from the diner, even Mr. Sandoval, the grumpy vendor from the old corner, standing proudly. "I used to think survival was all there was," she said, voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "That success belonged to people born in offices, not on sidewalks. But the truth is, sometimes survival teaches you more about business and about life than any textbook ever could. I'm not here because someone gave me a shortcut. I'm here because someone believed in me. And now it's my turn to believe in others." The applause was loud, but the quiet squeeze of Julian's hand afterward meant more than anything. Later that night, they walked home in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, both exhausted but light. Isabella paused at the door to her building and turned to face Julian. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I never thought I'd be this version of myself. Not just the girl who used to sell water, but someone who builds something real." He looked at her with a kind of reverence. "I saw it the first day I met you." She tilted her head. "You didn't even know my name." "I didn't need to," he said. "I saw fire. I saw purpose. I saw you." Her heart swelled, and for a moment, she didn't need to say anything. Because in that still night air, surrounded by the city that had once tried to break her, she finally felt whole. Not because she had found a man, not because of the foundation or the applause or the programs, but because she had finally found her place, one where she didn't have to change who she was to grow into who she was meant to be. And Julian, the man who had once ruled boardrooms and billion-dollar empires, had found something just as rare. A life not driven by power, but by love that was rooted, real, and unstoppable. Weeks after the Foundation's first successful launch, things seemed to settle into a rhythm for both Julian and Isabella. Yet even in peace, life has a way of testing what's real. Their journey had gone from street corners to strategy meetings, from stares of judgment to standing ovations. But with every step forward, a shadow from Julian's past began to creep back into the edges of their world, one that neither of them could ignore forever. The first sign came in the form of a phone call. Julian was in the middle of preparing for an upcoming board meeting when his assistant knocked on the door, looking unusually tense. "It's Ms. Bennett," he said quietly. "She insists on speaking with you. I tried to hold her off, but—" Julian sighed, his jaw tightening as memories surged forward. Naomi Bennett, his former fiancée, a woman bred in legacy and entitlement, someone whose idea of love had always come with conditions. He hadn't spoken to her in almost a year, ever since breaking off the engagement that never felt like a choice to begin with. Still, he picked up the phone. "Naomi," he said, keeping his tone even. "Well, look who finally answers." Her voice was cool, edged with amusement. "I hear you've become the city's latest philanthropist. Quite the rebrand, Julian. What do you want?" She laughed softly. "Relax. I'm not here to stir the past. I just wanted to extend an invitation. There's a gala next week, a private event, high-profile donors, media coverage. Thought it might be a good platform for your little foundation." Julian was quiet for a moment. "Thank you. But if I attend, I won't be coming alone." There was a pause. "You're bringing her," Naomi said flatly. "The water girl. Her name is Isabella." Another pause, heavier this time. "Then you better prepare her," Naomi said coolly. "That world doesn't take kindly to outliers." Julian hung up without another word. That evening, he brought it up to Isabella over dinner. The table was quiet for a long time after he explained. "You want me to go to a gala?" she finally asked, voice unreadable. "I want you by my side. That's all." Isabella leaned back in her chair, her fingers curled around the rim of her glass. "Julian, I don't belong in rooms where people think my worth depends on the brand of my shoes or the cost of my education." "You belong wherever you choose to be," he said firmly. "But if you're afraid of what they'll say, remember, you've already done the impossible. You built something out of nothing. You don't owe anyone an explanation." She looked at him, unsure, still feeling that old instinct to run before someone else tried to define her worth again. But Julian didn't push. He only waited, steady and quiet. And in that space, she found her answer. The night of the gala arrived, glittering with lights and wealth, and the kind of poised performance only the rich could master. Julian arrived with Isabella on his arm, her dress elegant but understated, exactly how she wanted it. She walked beside him with her head high, though her heart beat faster than ever before. Eyes followed them. Whispers floated through the marble halls. Isabella Carter, Julian Gray's charity case, the girl from the streets. She heard it all, but said nothing. At the bar, Naomi finally approached, her smile sharp as crystal. "Julian," she said sweetly, then turned to Isabella, eyes gleaming with veiled judgment. "And you must be the reason the city's favorite bachelor has turned into a suburban dreamer." Isabella smiled politely. "Only if you define dreams by compassion, not status." Naomi blinked, her perfect composure slipping for just a second. Julian placed a gentle hand at the small of Isabella's back, not to guide her, but to let her know he was there, always. They moved through the evening with grace, Isabella surprising even herself. She spoke with donors about the foundation, shared her story with quiet strength, and by the end of the night, more than one wealthy guest had asked how they could contribute. Not because of Julian, but because of her. As they left, Julian wrapped his jacket over her shoulders, the cool night brushing against them. as they stepped onto the steps of the Grand Hotel. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice low. "I'm proud of me too," she replied, and then, with a breath of laughter, added, "But don't ever ask me to go to one of these again. I think I've met my quota of caviar and fake smiles." He laughed, then turned serious. "Tonight wasn't about fitting in. It was about standing out. And you did, Isabella. You reminded them that power doesn't just come from legacy. It comes from courage." She looked at him, her heart full. "You've changed, you know." Julian tilted his head. "How so?" "You used to chase control. Now, you chase meaning." He smiled, then brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's because I found someone who gave my life both." They stood there for a moment, two souls from opposite worlds who had chosen each other, not despite their differences, but because of them. And in that moment, Isabella knew. They had walked through every doubt, every fear, and come out stronger, not as a poor girl and a millionaire, but as two people finally walking in the same direction, together. It had been a year since Julian and Isabella first crossed paths on that sun-scorched sidewalk in Barcelona. A year since a millionaire's curiosity met the fire of a girl who refused to be pitied. And now, as the seasons turned, so had their lives. Quietly, powerfully, and in ways neither of them could have predicted. The foundation they built together had grown into something far bigger than either imagined. What started as a scholarship initiative had transformed into a movement, one that empowered street vendors, single mothers, struggling students, and overlooked dreamers. Isabella was at the heart of it all, not as a symbol of charity, but as a leader, fierce, thoughtful, and unapologetically grounded. Julian often watched her from across rooms, sometimes filled with influential voices, other times filled with laughter from the community center. Every time, he was struck by the same thought: how someone who once stood under the sun selling $2 water bottles now commanded the attention of people who'd once looked through her. But even as their world expanded, Julian knew there was one promise he hadn't fulfilled. Not to her, but to himself. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the skyline and golden light spilled across the rooftop of their shared apartment, Julian called Isabella outside. She was barefoot, holding a book in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. "You look nervous," she said, raising an eyebrow. He smiled. "Maybe I am." She set her things down and joined him by the balcony rail. "What's on your mind?" Julian took a breath, then pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Her heart stopped. "I know we've already shared 1,000 firsts," he began, voice quiet but unwavering. "And I know our love didn't come wrapped in fairy tale perfection. It came through fire, through doubt, through choice, and that's what makes it real." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, not extravagant, not flashy, just a simple gold band with a sapphire stone at its center, deep blue, like the ocean she once dreamed of seeing. "I never wanted to change your world, Isabella. I only ever wanted to stand beside you in it. So if you're still the same girl who told me I couldn't buy her, then I'm asking the same way I should have from the start." He knelt down. "Will you marry me?" There was no hesitation. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she dropped to her knees too, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Julian. 100 times. Yes." The wedding wasn't in a cathedral or hotel ballroom. It was held at the very place they first met, the corner by the Plaza de Catalunya. where she used to sell water, and he had first watched her defy a stranger without flinching. The cooler stood beside them, now filled with handwritten notes from friends, students, and strangers whose lives they'd touched. The chairs were simple. The guests a mix of business tycoons and street vendors, professors and janitors, all equal in their presence. Julian wore a navy blue suit. Isabella wore a dress she had sewn herself, with fabric her mother helped choose. As they stood hand in hand, vows whispered under the open sky. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the continuation of everything they had fought for. Their honeymoon wasn't on a yacht or a private island. It was a train ride through Europe's lesser-known towns, where they walked markets, tasted street food, danced in small festivals, and shared dreams for the future, of children, of legacy, of a love that kept choosing each other even on the hard days. And there were hard days, days when critics still whispered, when business demanded too much of Julian, when Isabella doubted whether she could keep balancing it all. But they faced them the same way they had always faced the world, together. Years passed. The foundation expanded to 5 countries. Julian stepped back from his company to become a full-time advocate for economic empowerment. Isabella published a memoir that became a bestseller, not because it was glamorous, but because it was true. It was called More Than Water. And in a quiet corner of Barcelona, a bronze sculpture was unveiled. A young girl, standing tall, holding a bottle of water in one hand and a book in the other. At the base was a plaque that read, "To those who never had much, but gave the world everything." It didn't bear Julian or Isabella's name, but everyone knew who it was for. Their story was never about wealth or status. It was about how courage shows up in unlikely places, about how love doesn't save you, it sees you, and how sometimes the greatest riches come not from what we gain, but from what we're brave enough to give. And if anyone ever asked Julian how it all began, he'd simply smile and say, "She was selling water. I was dying of thirst, but not for the kind you think." Because what touched his heart wasn't her struggle, it was her strength. And what changed her life wasn't his money, it was his willingness to truly see her. And from that moment on, they both knew, no matter what the world said, love like theirs could never be measured in dollars, only in devotion, only in time, only in the choice to stay. Julian and Isabella's story is more than just a romance. It is a testament to the power of human connection, resilience, and the invisible bridges that can form between two seemingly different worlds. From the very first moment, a billionaire paused at a sun-drenched street corner and noticed a young woman selling bottles of water. A quiet revolution began, not just in his life or hers, but in the hearts of everyone who watched it unfold. He was a man of influence and stature, used to boardrooms and skyscrapers, while she was a young woman whose entire life was built on struggle, survival, and fierce independence. But in that moment, when their eyes met and their differences clashed, the foundations of something unshakable were born. What makes this story unforgettable is not the wealth or the obstacles, but the transformation that occurred on both sides. Julian, a man who had everything money could buy, found himself yearning for something that couldn't be purchased: authenticity, purpose, and love rooted in truth. Isabella, a woman who had grown used to fighting alone, found herself being seen for more than her circumstances. But she never allowed herself to be saved. Instead, she demanded to be respected. And that choice, that line she drew so firmly, is what earned Julian's deepest admiration. She taught him that love is not charity, that help is not always welcome unless it honors dignity, and that respect must come before affection. Through disagreements, misunderstandings, and even moments of heartbreak, they each held onto their identities. Julian didn't just fall in love with Isabella, he changed because of her. He learned to listen, to step back, to support without overpowering. Isabella, in turn, learned to accept that love doesn't always come wrapped in control. Sometimes, it shows up in quiet gestures, in someone who sells water with you in the rain, who fixes what's broken in silence, not for recognition, but out of care. Together, they turn their individual pain into a shared purpose. What began with a bottle of water became a movement. They built programs, lifted voices, and created opportunities for those who never had any. They walked into rooms that had once been closed off to people like Isabella and brought others in behind them. Their love was never the goal, it was the fuel. And perhaps that is what makes it so rare. Because in a world that often glorifies power and money, this was a love story about humility, about slowing down long enough to see someone else's worth, and about choosing each other not in spite of differences, but because of them. The lesson we can all take from Julian and Isabella's journey is this: never judge a person by where they are standing. The girl selling water on the street might have the soul of a leader. The man in the tailored suit might be quietly starving for something real. Beneath the surface of appearances lie stories we cannot imagine, and connections we might be too afraid to make. But when we dare to listen, to ask, to care without conditions, we unlock a part of ourselves that can transform lives, including our own. And in a time when the world feels increasingly divided by wealth, status, race, or experience, their story reminds us that real change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from looking someone in the eye and choosing to walk beside them. It teaches us that we don't need to have all the answers to make a difference. What we need is the courage to show up, the humility to learn, and the heart to stay even when things get uncomfortable. So as you carry this story with you, ask yourself, who are the people you've looked past today? What small act of acknowledgement could change someone's life? How can you use what you have, whether it's time, talent, or simply compassion, to make a difference in someone else's world? Julian and Isabella didn't plan their story. It happened because two people chose to see each other beyond the surface. And that choice changed everything. If you found something in this story that touched your heart, inspired you, or made you reflect on your own life, don't keep it to yourself. Share this story. Let it be a reminder that love, when built on respect and intention, can conquer even the greatest divides. And if you want more stories like this, stories that stir your soul and remind you of what truly matters, subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and gives us the strength to keep bringing powerful, emotional content that resonates. Thank you for being here. Let's keep sharing, connecting, and growing together.